Hey everyone, happy Thanksgiving. Today we've got a special feature. We've got an interview with Bruno, Seraphin, and Deniss Martinez, who wrote a paper on Indigenous Fire Futures, uh, talking about the concept of fire back. Here on Thanksgiving, it's a good time, I think, to think about Native people and history of America. Folks are telling different stories now about Thanksgiving than when I was in elementary school. And I hear the term thanks-taking. And I think of of all the things that we've taken away from Native people, fire is probably one of the biggest and one of the kind of worst offenses. We talk a lot about active forest management on this channel. I hear a lot of talk and see a lot of posts about, hey, if we just get back to active forest management, if we put the loggers back to work, we won't have these fire problems. Cutting down all the big trees was active forest management, and that really set us up for the wildfire disasters we're having now. So I think when we talk about active forest management, we need to look back farther. We need to look back thousands of years. Native people didn't have chainsaws, but they did have a mastery of fire. When we talk about land back and about giving Native people back land, what this paper is about basically is the idea that it's not enough to give land back if we don't give Native people back control of fire. And this is a radical idea for a lot of us, the idea that we turn fire management back to Native people, or control of it back to Native people. I enjoyed this conversation with Bruno and Deniss, and I think it's thought-provoking. If you want to read their whole paper, you can Google Indigenous Fire Futures. Anyway, happy Thanksgiving, y'all, and thank you for supporting The Lookout. Okay, so you're saying that the paper was about broadening the conversation around cultural fire.
Yeah, maybe broadening a bit, but also deepening it.
When you say deeper, you mean more radical?
Yeah, I would say so. I think in doing so, in kind of looking at our colleagues' work and bringing it all in one place, what the paper ended up being is this really great piece that has this conversation that is more complex than maybe what we would see in popular media about cultural burning.
Welcome to The Lookout. I'm here today with Bruno Seraphin and Deniss Martinez. They're scholars who've been studying indigenous burning in California and have written a new paper about indigenous fire sovereignty. And so I read the paper and I thought it was really interesting, and it kind of seemed to jibe with a lot of my experience of working with tribes in Northwestern California. This paper takes kind of what some might consider to be a radical view that Native people's use of fire is inseparable from their management of landscapes and their ability to have access to landscapes where they can practice their culture. And as a geographer who thinks a lot about fire at the landscape scale, that's intriguing to me because, we spend all of our time on the lookout here talking about how fires get managed at the landscape scale. And so thinking about putting control of what is now kind of a thoroughly kind of militarized, top-down response to fire back into kind of a cultural context where there's ceremony and tradition and family knowledge applied to all of what we consider to be tactical decisions. To me, that's fascinating. So I really wanted to get you guys on here to talk about that. So could you please introduce yourself?
So my name is Deniss Martinez. I descend from Tutunacu people. I'm also Mexican, and I am an immigrant in California. I grew up in Siskiyou County, and so there's just, there's a lot of fire in Siskiyou County, and there has been for a while. I grew up with it. I really, started learning from the environment kind of from that perspective, and got the opportunity to work with the Kadik tribe when I was in undergrad. And that's really what kind of set me on this path. I'm currently a research administrator at UC Davis, working with public domain allottees on cultural fire on their properties. So really excited about this work, and now I've gotten the opportunity to not just work with the Kadik tribe, but also North Fork Mono elder Ron Good, Dunlap Mono Julie Tex, just these wonderful people who have really mentored me, along with Diana Almendares, who's here near Davis, and we work with her at the Tending and Gathering Garden. So have really gotten to learn from a lot of people about what fire means to California, and I see that as really, a great way for me to learn about the environment, but also just as a responsibility as a guest here in California. I'm not Indigenous to here, and so really just trying to learn from Native people how they steward and how I can support their right to steward their places.
So I'm Bruno Seraphin, and I'm currently an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Connecticut, where I'm also an affiliate faculty with the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. I did a master's degree at the University of Oregon, and through some people that I knew at Oregon, I got connected with the Karuk tribe. So I spent a lot of time around Karuk people burning. And so basically anytime anything was happening that had to do with fire in Karuk Aboriginal territory, for a number of years I was there, including being on the ground kind of during and after the Slater fire of 2020. And so I just completed my dissertation, which has a lot of overlap with the article we're talking about today.
Great. So I've got some quotes from the paper, and I want to go through them and kind of read them and then have you kind of translate them for us. I think that a lot of my viewers probably aren't as versed in kind of the language of kind of modern social science. And so these paragraphs are pretty thick, and you look at them, you're like, wow, 5 really smart people collaborated to write, to parse every word here. And
we definitely nerded out. So yeah.
So I want to kind of pick apart a few of the key ideas here. One of them, one that I thought was pretty meaty. Okay, so it requires that we define TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge. And you say the integration of TEK and Western science will reproduce colonial relations of power and property and result in further dispossession unless it is partnered with structural changes such as the rematriation of indigenous lands and the redistribution of resources towards indigenous fire initiatives. An ecologically informed and sustainable future management paradigm that continues to be premised on indigenous marginalization would be little more than greenwashed eco-colonialism. Let's just pick that apart a little bit. So TEK is traditional ecological knowledge, and you're saying basically that if we just go and ask the Native people, hey, give us your knowledge, and we're going to use it to get better at firefighting, that things are going to get worse, basically. Is that correct?
Well, I think that it really comes down to the way that we think about knowledge. So I think in Western spaces, we think about knowledge as this thing that once you learn it, it is yours. And once you learn it, it's okay for you to kind of talk about it in different spaces without the person that originally taught you or outside the context that you originally learned it, or without having to reference those things as much. And so with TEK, what we've noted and what I've learned from the people that have taught me is that a lot of Indigenous knowledge is really place-based, place-specific, and it also comes with responsibilities. So you don't just learn something and then get to kind of just have that knowledge and accumulate knowledge without the associated responsibilities with that knowledge. And so for us, like looking at the way that sometimes academia, sometimes agencies are interacting with Indigenous knowledge, as in like, we're just going to go to the Native people, they're going to tell us what to do, and then we're going to do it, that kind of decontextualizes that knowledge, and that kind of drops the responsibility associated with that knowledge. And all of that, the knowledge, the responsibility, the people, the context, the place, are kind of this package deal without which that knowledge kind of loses meaning and it loses impact. Just the way we think about knowledge is really different. And then there's the aspect of really Indigenous people want to be able to practice these things, to practice and act upon their knowledge. Because one, it creates new knowledge. Like when you get to go out and practice in new situations, you can create new knowledge for your community. And two, it's cultural practice. And so the more that we're going to Indigenous communities to get them to tell us what to do, and then we go out and we get to be the ones out on the land and we get to go out and practice, I put that in quotes, like cultural burning, the less that they get to do it. And so what we're saying is that we're saying you can't just combine them without changing the structure of how things work. And what that means is, changing who we consider leaders, who we consider in charge, who gets to make decisions, and, who gets to have the power in those situations.
Yeah, and that idea that you're taking someone's time, that they could be spending that time teaching someone else what they're teaching you.
Exactly. They could be teaching youth or doing all kinds of things with their time. Everyone I know in Kudu country is just like super busy. So, if they take time to share something with you, it really means a lot.
Well, what resonated with me was when you say in your paper that a lot of white people like to think that colonization happened in the past and it's over with now and that we're in a new era. I've been following the current fires over there and watched a couple weeks ago. I was looking at the maps and I saw on one of the ops maps there was a private property on the Salmon River, and it suddenly had this like big red circle around it. It said restricted area, no entry. And you could see on the infrared that there was some burning that had happened there as the perch fire moved down towards the Salmon River. Native family burned out around their house, kind of imperfect prescription, right? It's like it's after the rains in the fall, and this is when Kaduk people have burned for thousands of years. Fire's coming down the hill, and they did a firing operation overnight, cultural burn, and suddenly like they're potentially looking at going to jail, right? And so when you talk about criminalization of cultural burning being an ongoing issue, it's like, well, yeah, it is. Like when you live in a place and you know the right thing to do, and suddenly there's a management team from the East Coast there, you've got no control over how they're going to fight the fire in your backyard, and you actually can get arrested for doing the right thing to protect your family and your property. So could you talk a little bit about that idea, just that colonization is an ongoing force?
We are drawing on a body of writing and critique that identifies and describes settler colonialism as an ongoing structure. Settler colonialism being a form of imperial invasion, occupation, and domination in which a group occupies another land, dispossesses the indigenous peoples, and then makes a home to stay, creating narratives and political systems that naturalize their own presence there, and make it seem like the indigenous peoples either weren't there to begin with or had no right to be there, or, for whatever reason, gave away their land consensually. And Karuk people, about 90 to 95% of their Aboriginal territory is administered by the U.S. Forest Service. There was no legal treaty, so this land is legally unceded. So both according to American law and according to Karuk law, there is no really legal justification for the fact that any of this land should belong to the federal government or even settler individuals, private properties, and businesses. U.S. laws and California laws inhibit the flourishing and inhibit the life chances of indigenous peoples, sometimes deliberately and sometimes sort of in a way that is kind of unintentional, but has devastating effects.
Right. Yeah, you say in the article that ultimately indigenous peoples have sovereign rights and responsibilities that precede and will outlast the settler colonial state of California.
I'm not saying the U.S. is on the verge of collapse, but we know that empires and different societies come and go. Will the U.S. still exist in 10,000 years? I don't know. But, my feeling in talking with Karuk cultural practitioners is they plan on still being on their territory in 10,000 years, continuing to look after it and fulfill the responsibilities that they have to take care of that territory.
I mean, I think for me, thinking about, settler colonialism, I think when I started working with Indigenous people in California, I think was when I really started to take pride in who I was as an Indigenous person. There's this pride in having survived so much violence and like an apocalypse of sorts, and still being subject to the way that settler states are controlling the way that we practice our cultures, our language. And despite all of that, despite having been through that and still having to kind of deal with policies and practices that, oppress our peoples, still people are practicing and pushing and doing all of this to really move our cultures forward. So when I think about the amount of grit and resilience it takes to continue a culture past all of that violence, I have no doubt that we could, still be, people could still be in their places and still committed to their cultures in 10,000 years.
Maybe talk a little bit about the connections between what you're talking about with settler colonialism, and in your paper you call it the colonial fire military industrial prison complex. This idea that the folks that end up having to actually do the dirty work of firefighting often end up being black and brown people from poor communities who've also been kind of left behind. I thought it was interesting that you drew connections there between kind of larger patterns of kind of white supremacy and the criminalization of being poor.
White supremacy in a lot of ways decides that some people are worth protection and worth safety and investment, and other people are just not. And it creates kind of classes of disposable people. And we see this in the way that communities are polluted. We see it in the ways that, war crimes are enacted on people. And so this is kind of a situation where you see that, folks in prison are in large part seen as disposable in some ways. And so they are asked to do dangerous work for very little pay. And I think that that's an aspect of white supremacy that we just see at work.
So often you have this conversation about the criminalization of Indigenous fire practices and the criminalization of Indigenous fire, sovereignty. And then there's conversations around, the use and, potentially exploitation of incarcerated firefighters in these very dangerous roles. It's true that the effectiveness of the fire suppression paradigm and model has led to a buildup of fuels around the U.S. West that has exacerbated the wildfire threat that we're currently facing, right? So, but when we say fire suppression is the cause of that, we have to look at actually like a much broader array of things that go into what fire suppression is, including the criminalization of Indigenous burning. That's a form of fire suppression. The removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands that they had been tending with fire and incarcerating them in military boarding schools. It's like, well, that was also kind of a form of fire suppression. And so looking at fire suppression is not just putting out fires, but it's like, okay, now we're talking about prisons, we're talking about policing, and we're talking about all the for-profit industries that benefit from prisons and policing, but also benefit from wildfire, whether it's vendors or, even government, federal and state agencies themselves have a financial incentive on the kind of working of what we can now see as this.
Right. Colonial fire military industrial prison complex. I'm a member of that complex. My whole career has been built on suppression money. The company that I started has made, millions of dollars pumping out maps of fires in the Klamath, right? I can't help but think, the technology that was used a couple of weeks ago to detect the fire start of this person burning out around their property to save it from an oncoming wildfire, that technology was invented to find people and kill them in jungles, and so there's just such a clear crossover. But the war metaphor, it just kind of comes naturally in this business, but there's a reason for that. And because, the original air tankers were used to drop bombs on Japan. So, building on that, I think I kind of showed some of these paragraphs to my wife and asked her, I said, I'm kind of lost on how to package this. And she says, well, a lot of white people don't like the rules around fire either, and I think we really see that over on the Klamath, where the native people and the settler people have all kind of come to have a common gripe about the kind of ineptitude of these absentee landlords that parachute people in from Maine to make tactical decisions on fires, in their backyard. Both native and local knowledge have been increasingly used during fires in the Klamath. And so I guess I'm curious about some of your ideas on kind of ways forward that, where there's shared benefit to both, because the settler communities, I think a lot of folks who are settlers in native lands, I've followed the kind of decolonize the Klamath settler movement. And when it comes down to it, everyone loves to talk about this stuff and drink coffee, and then at the end of the day, no one's going to give up their little cabin or their little cool sweet spot by the river. We love to talk about the theory and think that we're kind of woke to know the lingo. But when it comes down to it, what are your thoughts on kind of the settler indigenous relations?
Sometimes people might think that the way that we talk about fire is really radical, but I see it as an intervention to the way that we're thinking about things. I don't really hear from a lot of Native people interpersonally to their settler allies like, hey, you need to give up your land. They're asking for different things, and they may eventually ask for your land. I don't know. But I think that the focus is somewhere else right now. And I think that the anxiety about that area where there perhaps might be some disagreement, I don't think that should keep us from all of the shared work that is still left to do. Like, there's still a lot of shared work on our plate. There's still a lot of discussions about how we think an Indigenous fire future could look like, what it looks like in different places with different communities. I think that there's still a lot of ways to learn from each other. There's been really great opportunities where Indigenous people are teaching how to be a good settler ally. Part of it was something Bruno mentioned earlier, specifically aimed at academics and like journalists, but practicing Pikyav with the Kadu community. That's literally a document telling you how to be in partnership with them. I burn with Ron Good, and Ron, he's a very good teacher, and he's been teaching a lot of settler allies, including folks from CAL FIRE and other agencies, how they can show up, what they can do. And he's also very clear with them when they do things that he doesn't like. And so it's really about like allowing yourself to be in those spaces where you're uncomfortable because you're being told like, hey, like what you're doing, not cool. Or like you're being told to do things differently than you usually do them. Like just staying in that space long enough to learn and to have discussions is like where growth opportunities can happen for settlers and for anyone really. It really does come down to relationships too. It like depends on who you're in relationship with and what they are asking of you and what you can give.
I mean, I think the first thing is like land back is not that far-fetched, really. You know, like if you follow the people on social media that I follow, little examples of land back trickle in all the time. I'm like, oh, some rancher in Minnesota just like gave 500 acres, you know, of his land back to the tribe there. Or, oh, some municipality in Northern California just, you know, ceded a bunch of land back to an indigenous nation. So it's like, it kind of happens all the time. Sometimes there's like a property owner who isn't going to give away their land, but it's like they'll let cultural practitioners come and gather and use the land and, you know, gather those resources. I love Karuk Aboriginal territory. I love being there. It's an amazing place. I don't feel like I have to make it mine or say, oh, this is my place now. And I can be a guest there. And I actually have the benefit of being an invited guest when I go, because I like have this working relationship with folks there. And it's like all the places I've ever lived, I've never been an invited guest on Nipmuc land, on Cherokee land, on Kumeyaay land, all the other places I've lived. You know, it's the settler state that facilitated me moving there. I didn't, you know, there was no apparatus for me to check in with Kumeyaay people before I lived in San Diego. You know what I mean? So it's like, this seems very like basic or maybe esoteric, but it's something to kind of think about. Like being an invited guest is an amazing thing to be.
Yeah. And I think that's something to aspire to, right? Right now, a fire team that comes from the East Coast is an invited guest of the occupier, the invited guest of Rachel Smith, the forest supervisor. They come to Orleans and they set up and they're there to work for Rachel. So when I think of Native Fire Futures and Native sovereignty, wouldn't it be great if we mobilized 10 hotshot crews to come to Orleans and work for Vicki Preston? So can you talk a bit? You know, I just watched your video, Bruno, where you're talking about the women's treks. And one of the participants says that, looking around, they don't see any women really in the fire service when they're working on suppression. And that reflects this colonial structure. And I think that a lot of people don't realize that the indigenous women were really highly involved in deciding when to burn and how to burn and where to burn on Kaduk territory. Do either of you want to say anything about kind of gender roles in indigenous fire management and kind of or reflect on the lack of diversity and women in power in suppression and how that, maybe ties into your thesis?
I've had a very unique fire experience in that most of my experience on cultural fires is on private land, led by Indigenous people and with agency guests, but certainly not a huge agency presence. And so I've always had women to look up to in that space. And that's been something that's been really critical for me to feel confident and for me to know that I can, I can be in that space. I can use cultural fire. I can, be guided by people. I'm still not like in charge of anything, but there's women to look up to and there's women to learn from. And also in those spaces, they're just a lot more friendly to women in general. So there's a lot of kids, there's babies. And so I don't really see how I can see myself being at those burns throughout my whole life and not having to really interrupt that because I'm having kids or whatever. And that's really different from when I'm in agency-led spaces where it feels like, you can only participate if you have certain credentials. You definitely can't take your baby. I don't know. It's very different. And I think that in a lot of ways, it's a challenge in those spaces for Indigenous communities that, really have to collaborate with agencies or are burning on public land. It's really hard to bring in those values of centering, women, of centering mothers and children. And that's something I think that the women that led treks are thinking about, and I've talked to them about it. But it's one of those challenges when you're working in a hybrid space where it's really, you have to follow certain agency guidelines.
Yeah, it's the same here.
I mean, it's challenging.
Yeah, it's the same here with the PBA. I can take my 9-year-old out and they can, break out their snack box on the fire line. Yeah, and it's amazing. What else would you like to talk about around this concept of Indigenous Fire Futures? I think I missed that. In my prep, I kind of missed that futures part. I just was more focused on the fire sovereignty. But, I think by its nature, futurism is hopeful.
When we think about the future, I think a lot of people would, for example, be really challenged by the idea of thinking of a future without capitalism or a future where the US doesn't exist or, some of these really big changes in the future. But when we're thinking about a future without white supremacy or a future in which these sorts of oppression are no longer present and, Indigenous people can have fire sovereignty, it's a little bit more challenging, but I would argue it's very important because if we don't know, if we can't even see or potentially imagine where we're going, can't really act in the today as if that future will exist. I definitely want for my children and grandchildren to live in a world without white supremacy, to live in a world where Indigenous people are thriving. And that gives me hope. And it's also my job to keep that image kind of going in my mind, to keep imagining it, to keep forming it and reforming it, and to keep thinking about it, because otherwise we kind of go to the default. We go to what we see today, and we just kind of recreate what we see around us, and not everything I see around me right now I would like to have in the future.
Yeah, I think we've talked on this show before about the power of radical imagination and just
Yeah, that's
visioning, like,
exactly
okay,
it.
what is it that we want to see here, and let's just make it real.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess without being able to imagine, um, we'll never really get there because it's crushing to live in a world and to just accept the reality that white supremacy and these things will always exist and they'll always oppress us. Like that's a crushing thought. And you're like, if I really believed that way, I don't know that I would necessarily feel compelled to do anything. And that's why imagining these different futures is so important. And because, I think it brings us together as a community to be able to think about it together, to dream about it together. Even if I will never see it, um, still thinking about it is just like, it's a beautiful thing. And who knows, maybe it will.
There's a critical theorist who's kind of famous for saying it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism or something. That's like what he said, right? So it's just like you hear it and you're like, oh, that's obviously true. Like there's how many films are there about the end apocalypse, and we've seen it, we can picture it, but for all of us that like live in capitalism, it's really hard to imagine like what that would even look. But something that I think about is I think for a lot of folks, it's easier to imagine the end of fire suppression than it is to imagine the end of settler colonialism. And I think that's just true. And I think that's part of the impetus behind this Indigenous Fire Futures article is that I think to a certain extent, we can kind of start to imagine what it would be like if this fire suppression paradigm as it is no longer existed. If we had like community-based burning, we had PBAs, we had prescribed fire, we were like listening to fire ecologists, we were listening to local knowledge holders. But it would be possible to have a new paradigm of fire management in the West emerge, and for that new paradigm to really reduce the wildfire threat dramatically.
Well, climate change is
But
kind of doing that, right? Like, over the course of my career, the Klamath is burned almost completely. And so now you've got this nice mosaic of fire history that contains, you're not going to have a 1,000,000-acre fire in the Klamath because all the other recent fires fragment that landscape. And my home landscape of the Upper Feather River just had the Dixie fire. So we've got a 1,000,000-acre chunk there now that's not going to have another fire for a long time. And so as we kind of toil and theorize about the end of fire suppression, the landscape is evolving rapidly into new configurations that are going to change this conversation and make things, in some places, are going to make things possible like that.
Mm-hmm. But I think it's important to recognize that while like we can start to see what that would look like, I mean, I think it's also possible to imagine an end of fire suppression where it's like a lot of these policy and social goals are achieved, where Indigenous communities and Indigenous fire practitioners still don't have access to their land and haven't really benefited from that paradigm shift. And so I think when we're talking about sort of eco-colonialism or greenwashed colonialism, it's like, how far does that radical imagination really go? Like, yes, we're imagining the end, we're imagining a brand new fire paradigm, and that's a very exciting and good thing. But can we go further and also imagine a situation where Indigenous peoples are thriving and our institutions are geared toward protecting and promoting Indigenous sovereignty instead of overriding it or ignoring it? And so, we want to like, how far can you imagine? We want to like sort of ask people, I think, to imagine even a little more.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, like with climate change, I often ask my students, it's really great to think ambitiously about how do we avert, the 2-degree change, or how do we avert these like climate change metrics that are potentially catastrophic. Like that's important work. And what happens when you do it? Like what happens if we get there and we avert it? Like, is the world still the way you want to see it? And the answer is often no. Like there's other things that we want from our future, not just, a planet, but maybe a planet that's thriving and people and cultures that are collaborating well, people, all of these things that we we might imagine we want from our world and from our lives. And so, how do we imagine that too? Because we can't just plan to avert the end of the world and not plan for the kind of world we want.
Right.
Once we do that.
Right.
Yeah,
I think that we always need to vision what we want and not what we fear. We spend so much time fighting against what we fear and not enough time fighting for what we actually want.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Well, right now, I need to go. It's been great talking with you all. I appreciate the amount of energy you put into the justice aspect of working with tribes in a way that is fair and not extractive. And so also really appreciate your film work, Bruno, the storytelling you're doing. And I think, we love storytelling here on The Lookout. So we like the story that you're helping tell here, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you for reading our paper and for kind of wading through all of our nerdy sentences and paragraphs. It was really fun to write together. Thank you to our other co-authors, Tony and Peter and Kirsten. We're all like these kind of fire nerds, and we came together. And so the paper is great, and it is a little nerdy, but I'm sure folks will enjoy it. If they want to check it out, it is open access.
All right. Thanks a lot. I hope we get to burn together.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right.
Me too. Thanks so
See
much.
y'all later.
Thank you.